Hey guys, welcome to another episode of Already Christianity. For those of you that join us on a regular basis, we appreciate it. For those that are going to watch anew or later on in a replay, welcome. This is Already Christianity. It's an apologetics podcast. It comes from the Greek word apologia, to give an answer or a defense. Not that God needs us to, but we should be able to explain why we're Christians. What does that mean? And how does that affect our lives? And what purpose does that give us? And so that's what we try to do. The R stands for real, raw, and redemptive. We have real conversations. We do them in a very raw way. We take some criticism for that, but that's okay. So did Jesus. We just big raw. We just want to be a genuine and authentic. But hopefully these real and raw conversations lead people to a redemptive knowledge and a redemptive relationship with Jesus Christ, which once you get to know the real Jesus, everything changes. Nothing can stay the same. And so that's our goal ultimately. So we analyze everything, whether it's a current event or a theological concept or issue, through the lens or prism of a biblical worldview. We talk about current events. We'll talk about things that have come up in the past, in the future, what may come up in the future. Everything that we see the world through a biblical lens, and that means something. And we like to defend why the Bible is authoritative, why Christianity is logically consistent and doesn't violate the laws of non-contradiction. And ironically or not, today we're going to talk about, and we're going to analyze an example. And I don't want to come down too hard on this guy. A couple of people sent me this video we're going to analyze today. And we are called as Christians to glorify God in everything that we do. Our purpose is, we believe, is from John 17. It's to know God. And then Matthew 28:19 is to make him known to others, right? So you can't make him known to others if you don't know him yourself. So we're called to know God, John 17, and then to make him known to others, to go into all nations, making disciples of all men, teaching them to obey all that I commanded, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit, right? The Great Commission. We are commissioned to spread the gospel, whether through our words or through our actions, hopefully through your actions first, and then also through your words. We should be able to do both. And as we said many times, I think I got this from Gypsy Smith years ago. He said, always preach the gospel, and when necessary, use words, right? Or did he say, be the fifth gospel, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and the Christian? One of the two. But both of them are good, are good sayings that we should be living by. We should be able to preach the gospel with our words and our actions, and then be the fifth gospel. The gospel lives through us, right? And so that's where we're supposed to do our best, not perfectly, because we're broken like anybody else. We're just hopefully less broken than we used to be. But we're supposed to be preaching with our words and our behavior. And you judge a tree by its fruit, as Jesus said. So all that to say, we're going to talk about Bill Maher, our friend, Bill Maher. He's a critic of all religions, Christianity. He actually defends Christianity when you talk to him about Islam, which I think is appropriate. But he is very misguided and he's just...
I didn't think I'd hear Bill Maher in defense of Christianity.
He does.
Sentence,
but yeah, he does.
In the sense that it's the best of the worst.
Fair enough, but what I'm saying is,
we'll take it.
Yeah, we'll take it, at least in that setting.
It's an open window. We'll take it.
But who's this guy that he's interviewing? I don't even know who this guy...
Who knows?
Stefano, who's that?
I think he's a comedian.
Oh, comedian. Okay, well, whoever he is.
He was on MTV back in the
Do you have a
day.
microphone? Can people hear you?
Oh, yeah.
He was on MTV back in the day. He's a comedian, though. Yeah.
Okay. So I didn't know who the hell he was, but he's on Bill Maher, and somehow Christianity comes up. And then I just think he bites off more than he can chew. So Bill Maher is a seasoned critic. He's not as good as he thinks he is. He just hasn't been up against a good opponent. But he's a seasoned and long-time critic of Christianity. And this Stefani dude is obviously a brand new, open-minded. I don't know if he's a full Christian yet, but he definitely is open-minded to Christianity because he read Lee Strobel's book.
He said he believes in Jesus.
Well, so does the devil, right?
That's how he segued into
Right.
the conversation. He goes, I believe in Jesus, by the way.
Yeah.
And he was sort of egging Bill on.
Yeah.
And Bill's
But
like,
he picked
okay,
he
believe
picked,
whatever you want.
He picked yeah, Bill was trying to get out of it. He picked
"That's cool."
Yeah, he's like, I don't give a shit. But he picked a fight that he shouldn't have picked.
He was almost mocking him, though. He's like, seriously, you really want to
Oh,
do this
he was
right
so
now?
condescending.
He's like, let me just sort of pop your bubble kind of thing.
Well,
He was
because
very
you could
condescending.
tell Bill had not, this guy wasn't presenting anything that Bill had not. Well,
Yeah.
first of all, this is my perception of this Stefani dude. He read a book, and we've taught on Bill on Lee Strobel's Case for Christ, the Case for a Creator, and the Case for Faith, and they're good. I mean, they're effective. They're good tools. I love Lee Strobel's his journey. I think he's been wonderful for advocating and pushing Christianity and spreading Christianity. But this guy reads this book. It's like some of the people that read the Evidence That Demands a Verdict from Josh McDowell. and you get on fire because you're reading this book and it's like, oh shit, this makes sense. And he kind of had these sound bites in his head that he thought he was just gonna he was trying to take his thinking that affected him and influenced him and thought he could vomit it on Bill. And Bill was just like, come on, dude. I mean, just shut the fuck.
I remember when I first
I was
got,
so
first
frustrated
got to the
watching
States,
this damn
I was thinking
thing.
to myself when I first got to the States as a little kid, and I thought this guy would have benefited from some of the same instruction that I had when I came. And English was at that time my second language.
You speak Portuguese.
Right, that's my first language, and so when I arrived here as a former refugee, I'm thrown literally within a month. I'm thrown into the American educational system. I go to a public school, and then they have what's called these reading sessions, and then they had this thing called reading comprehension, where you would read something, and then there were some basic tests that you had to go through to see whether you comprehended what you read. And I thought to myself as I was listening to this guy would have benefited from that. And that was when I was in second grade and third grade. He didn't seem to, and I don't mean as a dig, I'm just saying from what he regurgitated to Bill, I couldn't think of anything that was right.
Yeah.
And I thought to myself, that's a lost opportunity, unfortunately. And it seems like there's a long trail of Bill talking to people about Jesus who don't seem to be able to to communicate Jesus.
A for effort, F for effectiveness. You know what I mean? That's my assessment. Look, do we have the clips? These are small clips, right?
Yeah.
How'd you break them up, Jeff? What are you doing?
They're
over
about
there?
90 seconds each. There's 3 of them.
All right, go ahead.
All right, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Give me a second. Try that one more time. Here we go.
I'm going to have to burst your bubble. Now, because here's I have to spit a couple
I
of
believe
facts.
in Jesus, by the way. We'll talk about that.
Oh.
I'm reading The Case for Christ by Lee Strobel. It's convincing evidence.
What do you think? I throw people out of the club here? We believe in whatever you want.
I didn't. I went to Catholic school my whole life, but after reading this book, Case for Christ by Lee Strobel, the factual evidence that he existed is kind of overwhelming.
I'd like to see that because the factual evidence that he existed has always been underwhelming. In fact, it's always...
Read Case for Christ.
Yeah, I
Give
will.
it a shot by Lee Strobel.
This is based on what? Archaeological finds?
Archaeological finds.
New ones?
Theological finds. Ivy League.
What are theological finds?
Bill, ready for this?
Yeah.
If I told you, okay, if I told you factual evidence about Alexander the Great, you would believe me.
Okay, but even still, it's a silly point because who cares if Jesus lived? It's whether he's then died and was reborn and is up in heaven with his Father, who's really him. Okay, that's the part where the rubber meets the road. Maybe he existed. I agree. That's absolutely possible. He may have existed.
But according to Case for Christ, independent sources who didn't know each other, who wrote about him within 20 years of his death, talked about these miracles happening as in real time.
Okay, well, again...
And Alexander the Great's biographers, the earliest one was like 100 years after he died.
That's tough to listen to and watch.
I mean,
it's just archaeological evidence, theological evidence. He goes, what the hell is theological evidence?
What are theological finds?
Yeah,
That's a good point.
Look, it's a good point. And I love this guy. What's his name again? DiStefano. Chris. I'll call him Chris because I'm going to jack up his last name. This guy, Chris, I love his passion. It seems like he's fired up, but he kind of walked into the lion's den and he almost, like you said earlier, picked the fight. He invited it, and then I don't know if he thought he was going to get an aha moment from Bill. There's a couple of issues that when you dissect people. So Bill has gone from the point of, Jesus is a myth. I don't know if he existed, which atheist scholars will tell you that a first century Jew named Yeshua walked this earth. I mean, there's no doubt. I mean, that's not even, you lose credibility
That's true.
as a scholar. It just
Virtually every scholar,
everybody, Richard
liberal or conservative,
doesn't matter.
acknowledged that Jesus was a historical figure
Correct.
who lived in the first century in Judea. That this is without
Controversy.
by anybody serious. Anyway, there's one or two, but they're usually marginalized in the literature.
So you take that out. So I think, and then Bill took that argument away from him. He's like, look, okay, I have no problem with the idea that Jesus lived, and maybe he did, but was he God? And did he die and raise? He didn't get reborn. I don't know what the hell he's talking about. He's thinking of Osiris or Iris or whatever.
That's right.
You're right, Osiris.
Well, no, he makes that false comparison in his documentary and from 2007 called Religulous. Yeah, I mean, and there's just no comparison. But again, this guy's not in a position, it seems, to just push back and say, hey, Bill, what you said is just nonsense, and here's why.
Well, look, and you don't have to be to that degree. I just think you have to know where you're at in your advocacy, and then and just because you don't have an answer, it doesn't mean there's not an answer. I use this example all the time. If someone asks me an answer to calculus or a calculus question, first of all, I'm texting George, but if he doesn't answer, I'm going to say I don't know the answer. But that doesn't mean calculus is bullshit. It just means I don't know the answer. Someone knows it. Right. And when George calls me back, he'll give you the answer. I mean, so it's that people have to be comfortable saying that. But he doesn't even, he invites it and then doesn't push back on Bill. And then the Alexander the Great, I think that was an example that Lee Strobel used kind of as with Alexander. He gave a comparison of evidence with Alexander the Great. I don't remember. I didn't read the book. I watched the series that we did this Bible study on. But it kind of fell flat because there was no context to it. He kind of wanted to jump into an example, an analogy, and he didn't build it up right. I mean, I love I appreciate his excitement. I love that, but I just don't think he should have engaged.
I think the way to frame that argument is to say that Alexander the Great lived in the early 4th century, and his exploits, he was a young man when he died, maybe 25, 30 years of age. And so, okay, so that's when stuff happened. When was it first written down? When do we actually have a complete, cogent narrative about what Alexander the Great did? And you'd have to go to places like Plutarch's writings in the 2nd century A.D. So now you're what? You're 500 years, 5 centuries removed. And then I would have drilled down a little bit further. And yet no one questions whether Alexander the Great existed.
That's right.
Or whether he in fact did what he did. And then I would drill down even further. I would have gone into Plutarch as an excellent comparison of a guy who wrote a shit ton of biographies, some 50 biographies in the 2nd century. And because remember, the criticism was their names aren't even there. Like in the gospel writers, you don't see the gospel according to Matthew. That came later. That wasn't in the original manuscripts. The gospel according to Mark, the gospel according to Luke, the gospel according to John, that actually was not in the original manuscripts. How do we know that was Matthew that wrote that? How do we know that was Mark? How do we know that was Luke and John? Because the original manuscripts don't have their names there. How do we know? And it strikes me as relevant, Nico, that no ancient writing would have written. The author would not have
not just biblical ancient writing,
not just I mean, including Plutarch. So if you look at those 50 or so biographies, Plutarch's name is in none of them at all, because it wasn't a custom.
Right.
And this was across the board, whether it was writings on faith or writings on history. I would have said, actually, if their names had been written, that would have been a reason to question their authenticity. But I mean, there's so many opportunities.
But that's a specific apologetic, right? I mean, that's a specific defense.
But these are doors he opened up by his
I 100%
line of
agree with you.
questionable
I agree with that.
argumentation.
I agree with that.
And I think those are places where you don't have to be have a PhD in history to kind of park a little bit and say, look, is this a criticism of just Christ, or what about every other classic ancient work? Do we throw those out the window?
And we're going to talk about those writings, because he questions the writings and how do we know they're accurate and all this other stuff. And I just have some data that George, you and I have presented before, and there's other writings also of how many actual manuscripts we have of other ancient writings versus what we have in the New Testament in all the different languages. And it's as Daniel B. Wallace, you always say, it says it's an embarrassment of riches, right? I mean, Daniel B. Wallace is a wonderful textual critic.
Yes.
He goes back and he studies these manuscripts and see how close they are to the original manuscript, the original writing versus the manuscripts, because all ancient documents we don't have originals of. All right, I mean, we just don't.
We don't have the original man. That's right, the original manuscript.
Whether it's
the
Caesar,
autographs.
Plato, Tacitus, Pliny the Younger. I'm gonna have a whole list of them here. Suetonius, Sophocles. I'm gonna pronounce some of these names wrong. But we'll talk about how many we have of those. But let's get into the second, because I want to get through all three of these, and then maybe just kind of bullshit around on how would we answer these questions. Maybe I'll dive a little deep with you and use you as my expert witness to kind of dive.
They really didn't get into the meat. They
No,
introduced,
well,
they introduced one objectionable comment about the idea of it showing up 100 years later. That's fallacious. It's not true. But let's get into the second part, because that's where they really, get into the meat.
Well, there's three. There's this.
Okay.
It's Hollywood.
There's only two sources in the Bible. There's the four Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
Okay. There's also another guy, Josephus, who wasn't accepted, but read the case for Christ.
Not in the Bible.
Okay.
But the Bible is itself an anthology. They found some few decades ago the Dead Sea Scrolls,
Right.
which
Shout 'em
were
out.
other books that were just basically edited out. So right away we know a person decided what constituted the Bible, and just some stuff wound up on the cutting room floor.
I get it. Council
So-
of Nicaea. I get it.
Council of Nicaea, yes.
325 AD.
Yes.
That's when they decided the Christian
Right.
religion. I agree with you.
Right.
I'm with you
I
on that.
remember that.
But I'm telling you, read this book.
That's Emperor Constantine.
Shout out
The-
Constantine, Turkey, all that.
Well, the first one,
Constantinople.
the first one to change the Roman Empire
Right.
to a Christian empire.
They decided all the
took
holidays.
3 centuries.
I get it. And
Okay.
listen, Bill,
But-
I'm with you on that.
But here's the important point.
Let's do it.
There's only these 5
A
sources:
little bit more tequila, that's it.
Matthew, Mark, Luke, and
I'm
John.
wrecked right now.
Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
Good boys.
Not contemporaries of Jesus, not even close. Matthew,
Okay.
so they lived from 70 to 110 years after him.
I understand.
No, from 40 to 70 years after.
But they got their information from Josephus, who lived about 10 years after Jesus.
So already we're into a game of telephone.
I'm sorry, what was that claim, my last claim?
The game of telephone. So
no,
first,
Josephus. But he calls him Josephus. It's
he
Josephus.
says that it's Josephus, and he says they got information from Josephus. Josephus was as a Jewish historian that's an observer. He's not anyone that's adding to the Bible.
Right,
He
but
doesn't.
what was the timing? He said 10 years after
He said
what?
Josephus or Josephus is 10 years after, so he's trying, which is really 4 years after.
But it's just wrong.
It's just he's completely wrong. I mean, first of all, Josephus is not an author or a contributor to the scriptures. The Dead Sea Scrolls is a separate issue. The Gnostic Gospel is a separate issue. One person didn't decide on the Bible. The Council of Nicene and the Council of Trent and all these different councils, the scriptures and what was being taught and the traditions had long been already happening. It wasn't like just someone came up, one person in the Council of Nicaea said, screw it, man. We're going to cut these out, cut that out. I'm making all the decisions.
But let's back up. And I need to correct this, Nico, because the Council of Nicaea had very, very little to do with determining which books went in the Bible. The focus of the Council of Nicaea was to talk about the nature and character of Christ.
yeah.
And that was the debate between Arius and Athanasius, which thankfully Athanasius won. It was really a giant episode or enterprise, really, a meeting to correct false doctrine concerning the nature and character of Jesus Christ. And there were debates around this across the empire. And when Constantine, he's right about this, Constantine actually was a huge force towards bringing the various bishops together from the various regions to iron out these centralities of the gospel. If you can't agree on who Jesus was, and what he was and what he did as a result of who he was, we got big problems here. So we brought them together into a room, and it was what was left on the cutting floor was a lot of bullshit about who Jesus was. The two arguments was, is Jesus in essence and in nature the same as God, a separate person, but same essence as God, eternal essence? Is he in fact God, or is Jesus a chief agent for God, who is a representative of God? Perhaps the first and created being of God who acts on God's behalf. Those are two different propositions. And what was left on the cutting floor was the notion that Jesus was what's referred to as it's not ontological Christology, it's functional Christology. What was left on the cutting floor is that Jesus was functionally Christological, that he just acted as a rep for God. He was actually God. Thank goodness that that won out, because that in fact reflects how the scripture positions Jesus. So this had nothing to do with deciding which books. By that time, we already had a fully functional and complete New Testament. We really did. And you can go back. I think that you have to go back to what's called the Muratorian canon in 180 AD, and you literally have every single Old and New Testament book there, with the exception of maybe 4 or 5 New Testament books that were being circulated, but they hadn't been ratified because there were some open theological questions. But by the time you get to Council of Nicaea, are you kidding me? You've got a canon of Scripture, a functioning canon of Scripture around which there's significant uniformity. This is an important thing. This would have been an important thing, I think, to hash out in this conversation.
But this guy, Chris, he gave in too much. I got you. I'm with you. You're right. I'm with you. He didn't know what the hell he was agreeing to, unfortunately. Again, I don't want to be too critical on him. I just wish he was a little wiser in the fight he picked, because he wasn't ready for it.
But even low-hanging fruit. Oh, these guys lived 40, and I know where he's getting the 40 from. This is generally accepted. Bill's done some reading, but he's taking his sound bites from guys like Bart Ehrman, who is a New Testament critic, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and the guy's pretty dynamic. And you've heard the name Bart Ehrman over the last 25 years. I think Strobel does a great job putting up scholars against him in the Case for Christ video documentary, which I would recommend people watch.
It's on YouTube.
It's very, very well done. And they just shred a lot of Ehrman's arguments. And what Ehrman basically says is that virtually everything in the New Testament is a forgery. That's his claim. And so you could pretty much dismiss it as fanciful and basically fairy tales. He wrote books like Misquoting Jesus and Jesus Interrupted. And I think Bill pulls some sound bites from that. But for him to say that the authors of the Gospels didn't live until 40 to 70 years after Jesus is just complete rubbish. I can't think of a single scholar who would ever adopt that position. It's just nonsense. I mean, in Matthew chapter 9, you have Jesus calling who into ministry? Matthew. He's a tax collector, for goodness sakes. Does that sound like he's not being born until 70 years later? I mean, we could do this all day long. Luke wrote Acts. He wrote the Gospel of Luke, but he also wrote Acts. And we know from the way Acts is written that it's being detailed in the immediate aftermath of the resurrection of Jesus.
We don't have the destruction in Acts, right, of the temple.
The temple.
Right? We don't have the temple destruction.
That's right. You could literally take, and that's a great point, you could take Acts chapter 1 all the way to Acts 28, and you can literally stop right around 62 AD just by the events that are described there.
Right.
And then and I don't know where, I'm lost. Where did the Josephus, he means Josephus, where did he get the idea that Josephus in any way contributed
I have no idea.
to the narrative content of the Gospels?
In the background, and Jesus is like 20 feet in the distance, you know.
But he's the one that interjected that. Bill didn't.
Yeah.
So if we can correct, and you and I do this in seminars, we correct the record on Josephus. Josephus is an important extra-biblical contributor.
He is.
He's a Roman Jewish historian. He lived between 37 and 100 AD. And this guy's a fascinating guy. He really is. He's not really a devout Jew. He's more Roman than anything. He was very good friends with the emperor, the general at the time, who sacked Jerusalem between 66 and 73 AD, who was Vespasian. Vespasian became an emperor in 69 AD in the aftermath of the suicide of Nero. Well, assisted suicide.
Yeah,
he had some help.
Yeah.
So, but if I was going to say, is he more Roman than Jewish? I'd say in terms of his allegiance, he's far more Roman.
But he's a historian, so he writes about Jesus' half brother.
He writes about the crucifixion.
He writes
of Jesus.
about the crucifixion. He writes about
Pontius Pilate, the death of John the Baptist. He
the
writes
death
about
of
the
James,
death of James the Just.
the brother of Jesus.
So he corroborates the history.
And he speaks of the people of the way. Remember, they weren't called Christians, as you know, George, of course, until after the first century. They were called people of the way because Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. They weren't called Christians until after that.
And the first time they actually were called Christians is in Antioch. That community, by the way, is still around today. And people, remember a few years ago, people were freaking out because ISIS was getting frighteningly close to Antioch. And they thought they were going to ravage really what is still the first community from biblical times of Christians. And that's where they were first called Christians. It's in Acts chapter 11, verse 26. But you're right. And Josephus doesn't give them the history of the Gospels. He corroborates key elements.
That's right.
The existence of Jesus, the death of Jesus, the crucifixion of Jesus under Pontius Pilate. You guys, you can look this up if you're listening in. There's 2 volumes called Antiquities of the Jews, volumes 18 and volume 20. And then there's something called Jewish Wars, specifically volume 5. And there he talks about crucifixion in painful detail. He gets into how the Romans crucified people. And that really gives us insight into what we have learned about crucifixion as it pertains to Jesus.
Yeah.
So Josephus is immensely important, but the idea that
he's actually an apologetics point that Lee Strobel and a lot of people make in corroborating. And I look at evidence and I'm putting a case together. There's direct evidence, there's circumstantial evidence, there's corroborating evidence. Josephus, amongst Suetonius and Pliny the Younger and Lucian and all the other, these are all non-Christians, and Phlegon. These are corroborating facts. Some more in different ways. They're justifying and bolstering the gospel message and the biblical message.
Absolutely.
Let's look at that third, video. I guess you get that going.
St. Paul,
Good guy, St. Paul, a.k.a. Saul, and the capital of Minnesota.
is the other source of the Bible.
Yes.
There's Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. I said the 2 names out of order because that's the order in the Bible. The first gospel, Mark, is 70 AD. Jesus dies in 33. So that's 40 years almost after he died.
Okay.
So not contemporaries. Paul comes before the gospel writers. He's writing around the year 50, in the 50s.
Okay.
So he's much closer to Jesus's time. So you'd think he would know more about Jesus than the people who came later, but actually St. Paul knows almost nothing about Jesus. He barely conceives of him as as a person who lived on earth. There's no details about his life like they are in the Gospels. So the people who came later know more than the person who wrote earlier. Just some food for thought.
But, okay, I understand. But he does acknowledge at some point, right? Paul, a.k.a. Saul, knows that Jesus existed, right? He talks about him.
He talks about, I'm saying he conceives him as a Godhead. He doesn't have this, it's not the narrative that's in the Gospels of Jesus went around and he did miracles and he did stuff and everybody loved him and he gets quoted a lot. He makes speeches, blessed are the meek. He has adventures. He goes into the desert. It's a whole thing.
But what about...
And then at the end, it's a whole drama with, he's crucified. Oh, no. Paul doesn't know any of this. All the stuff that the gospel writers obsess about and that are his biography. It's a little strange.
But Paul, it's okay for Paul to be somebody who maybe, there was a lot of people who didn't like Jesus.
You know what's okay?
And that's okay.
What's okay is that some people believe and other people don't. That's what's okay. It's like, that's you.
I used to be disgusted with people that believed. So I'm glad that at least he takes that position in the end, but he's just wrong.
But this is a segment where I thought so much stupidity and so little time. It's like, how are we going to, how can we possibly get through everything that was said that was so wrong? This idea that Paul's writing things and the gospel writers writing things are different than when the gospel writers actually were born. He doesn't make those distinctions. So it's important to recognize some truth before we get into the lie. It's true that it's arguable, at least it's conceivable, that Paul would have written before the earliest gospel would have been penned. Now, I want to be very clear about this. The narratives of the gospel were in circulation. But that's a very different thing than to say they were first, they didn't exist until they were penned.
Right.
So something can be in circulation as history or tradition before it is actually written into a compendium, into a volume, into a book, a novel, whatever. And that's really what we have here. And so the question becomes, from the time that the events happened, and you know where I'm going with this, from the time that events happened to the time that we actually had a formulated New Testament, what the hell was going on? A bunch of error, a bunch of myths and fantasies? So that's the other argument. But I just want to clarify here that this notion that the gospel writers didn't live or weren't around and they weren't contemporaries of Jesus is just utter bullshit. There's not a single scholar who attests to that. The issue is, when was this stuff written? And did a bunch of error seep in as a result so that when we look at the Gospels, we can't actually say this is historically reliable? See, that it's such a convoluted mess. here in this conversation that I don't really know what arguments they're trying to make.
I don't either.
You have to throw out the whole damn thing and start over. And then he gets to Paul, and I thought, I wonder if Bill, ironically, by admitting that Paul was writing early, I wonder if he realized, and I don't think he did, that he stumbled into a great apologetic for the fact that Paul literally received the gospel message. What's the gospel message? The idea that God inserted himself in history, Emmanuel, God with us, through the person of Jesus Christ, God's only son, to reach into this human mess of rebellion, died a miserable death, sacrificed himself for us because we were in rebellion, made a way back to God, right? I mean, he was resurrected and basically has given us power over sin and death. Praise the Lord. That's the gospel message. That narrative was already in circulation, and Paul says it, and he brings it up. Paul actually says in 1 Corinthians 15, he says that I received this and I passed it on. And he pegs his conversion to when he first received that message. So the question is, when was Paul converted? And how does that match up with the resurrection of Jesus Christ? Because that gives you a sense of how early that core message of the gospel was in circulation.
Well, that creed dates back very
And we
soon.
need to answer that question.
Yeah, that
Go ahead.
creed in 1 Corinthians 15, right?
The creed dates to 51 AD. And we know that because we know when Paul was in Corinth. We know that because the book of Acts tells us that in Acts chapter 18, verse 1, it says that Paul was in Corinth. And this was at the tail end of his second missionary journey. You know that Paul had 3 missionary journeys, and this is the tail end of the second missionary journey, which started somewhere around Acts 15:36 and ended at about Acts 18:17. So Acts 18 is at the very tail end of his second missionary journey, and then he says he was in Corinth at a particular time. Does anyone remember when that was? Because this matters, because it's in there, and he says that he was there at the time that Gaius was the proconsul of Achaia. That's a very specific time. And for the longest time, people like Marr will say, well, this is clearly a crock of shit because no one knows who Gallio is. And for the longest time, nobody knew who Gallius was. And then one day we have this thing called an archaeological find.
Yeah.
And we learned that Lucius Junius Gallius Annianus was truly a prefect,
What'd
a
you say about-
proconsul. Yeah, I know. I knew you were going to go there.
You said anus.
Yeah. You're not offended, are you? Yeah, it's anus with another N-E on the end, but I digress. So this is important because it's discovered in 1905. It's unearthed. They're doing a bunch of excavations in Western Greece on the Peloponnesian Peninsula, and they're going about their business, and they're really fascinated with stuff that they found concerning the Temple of Apollo. And all of a sudden, they find 4 fragments, inscribed fragments. And it actually is now called the Gallius, or the Gallio inscription. And what we learned from that is that Gallio was the proconsul of Achaia between July 1st of 51 and July 1st of 52 AD. And Paul says he was there for 18 months in Acts chapter 18. We've pinned Paul to 51. So what does that mean relative to his conversion?
But I heard before he penned the creed. Go ahead. The creed in 1 Corinthians 15 that the creed had been circulating long before that. I've heard Jim Warner Wallace, I believe, pin it back not to Paul's writing in 51, but the creed was being circulated amongst people of the faith.
Let's continue, and I'll give you a date.
It goes back like super close.
Absolutely, and this is why this is important, because that's a starting point. We have Paul at a particular
Okay, you're just
place.
saying on the far end, it's 51 AD.
No, that's where Paul is saying in 1 Corinthians 15, by the way, it's a creed, 3-7. We should define what a creed is, by the way.
Say it.
A creed is basically a declaration. It's a statement. And it's a statement that's crafted in such a way to make ease of memorization possible among a group of people so that a lot of information can be conveyed accurately over time. And a creed, you can tell because there's a bunch of creeds throughout the New Testament.
That's right.
Because this is how people communicated.
That's how they remember it. And by the way, really quick, don't forget, I know you won't forget much. You won't forget your thought. But when they did the first video, they talk about the whole bullshit, phone, word of mouth of what is it, oral tradition. Where
yeah, it's painful to hear that
it's
shit.
such a rudimentary, false Did you get
It is.
30 people in a row? You whisper in somebody's ear, you know what you said, and they tell the next person for 30 people. Then the 30th person speaks out loud and says, "This is what I was told." It's like, aha, no, you're not. Look how oral tradition sucks. That is not how historical
Not at
or
all.
ancient oral tradition went.
exactly
Matter of
right.
fact, there's been studies on this stuff. It is very reliable oral
is.
tradition. So
It is.
and non-Christians will agree with that
No, that's
also,
an-
not just
that-
Christians.
That's a significant.
Okay, I just wanted to do that little point.
to make. Virtually any scholar who knows anything about traditional oral traditional methods knows that it's a great way to preserve information and rather accurately. But if you start in 51 AD with that creed, and again, we just defined a creed, and a creed has a certain structure. If you're working your way through the New Testament, you can kind of pick out a creed. It reads in a particular way. The language changes. There's a poetic and a rhythmic essence to it. It uses words like received and passed on. And Paul does exactly that in 1 Corinthians 15, 3-7. I think that's the most famous of the creeds because he packs so much and because he pegs that creed to when he was converted, to your point. So when was he converted? Paul had just written the letter to the Galatians, and he wrote right around 49 AD. If you read it in the beginning of Acts 18, he says he meets Priscilla and Aquila. They're fellow evangelicals, if you will. They're fellow missionaries. And they had just been recently kicked out of where? Of Rome. By whom? Claudius. And this is mentioned in Acts 18. Now, Claudius was an emperor of Rome, and he ruled between 41 and 54 AD. Well, the evidence shows us, and actually guys like Gaius Suetonius, who was a Roman historian that lived between 69 and 122 AD, he tells us that these people were kicked out, because he talks about in Life of Claudius, volume 25. He says that they were kicked out right around 49 AD under Claudius. So those jive. So Priscilla and Aquila had recently been kicked out of Rome. They meet Paul in Corinth in 51 AD because it was at the time that Gaius was the proconsul of Achaia. Now let's work our way backward. In Galatians chapter 1, verse 18, Paul says that when he started his ministry, he went where for 3 years? To Arabia. He was in Arabia for 3 years. Now, Arabia at that time included parts of the Sinai Peninsula. It included parts of what is now Saudi Arabia. And he ministered there for about 3 years. So we begin subtracting. 51 minus 3 places us at about 48 AD. And then he says in Galatians chapter 2, verse 1, that when he first came to know the Lord, that he spent 15 days with James and John in Jerusalem. And then he spent 14 years in Syria and Cilicia. Now, why does that jive? Because Cilicia is an area where Tarsus is, which is where he's from.
Paul of Tarsus.
So he spends 14 years there. So 51 minus 3 is 48. 48 minus 14 is what? 34. Now this is he's making these statements at the tail end of his second missionary journey.
Boom, and he
But he
kills
didn't have, he didn't have an airplane. I mean, he's walking around.
This is so cool.
So he's walking around, and it's taken him a while. So we got to give the man some time to walk around. He's walking thousands of miles. Subtract a year or two. And last time I checked, 34 AD, and he gets back to literally within a year at most of the death of Jesus Christ.
Right.
So Paul, and when is Paul converted in Acts, Jeff? Acts chapter 9, correct.
That's right.
So we've got Jesus ascending in Acts 1:8. We have Acts chapter 9, that's 8 chapters. And Christians are moving. They're literally moving from Judea, Samaria to Jerusalem, from Jerusalem to Judea, Samaria to the ends of the earth, Jesus says in Acts 1:8. And they're moving. And so you have them basically still hanging around that region in Acts chapter 9. Paul is converted. I mean, this is happening right there, not long after Pentecost.
Wow.
So this is the Apostle Paul,
the
and
road-
he says he got it
So
from someone else.
you're saying the road to Damascus is somewhere in 34 AD.
That is a fact.
But, I got it. But I mean,
No, I think it's earlier than that,
Right.
because we need to account.
well,
for
we
the
know,
amount
but
of-
we know Paul was a contemporary, right? Because you talk about him meeting
Yes,
once he converts with James and John. Then him and Peter go at
Right.
it a couple times,
Exactly.
and they're busting each other's balls, and they're really
Exactly.
fighting. And then they work it all out. But so Paul's a contemporary. See, this is the kind of stuff. But the creed had been in circulation since back then, correct?
right, because he says that
So-
he received the creed.
Because right, exactly.
And his conversion.
So I've heard some people argue that the creed was in circulation as close as 4 months after Jesus' resurrection.
We're splitting hairs here.
Right?
At this
I mean,
point. Right, because
within a year.
I'm putting this within a year.
Okay, fair enough. Okay.
So if
When
we
is Pentecost 40 days after, so yeah, so
40 days to a year.
Yeah.
How about that?
yeah.
I mean, think about what we're talking here.
Yeah,
we're talking
no.
about ancient history,
But-
and this is the beautiful thing about the book of Acts, Nico. You've heard us say it. We've
Yeah.
said it many times. If you've got a book that's trying to traffic in bullshit, this is a really bad way to do it, because he's
He's
putting
inserting history.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly right. And so we have to think about how things were conveyed. And I wanted to, Jeff wants to say something, but you brought up oral tradition, and I don't want to lose sight of that because that's so critical. The use of creeds to convey information was absolutely essential. You see, history and tradition go hand in hand. How do we know that the gospel writers were the gospel writers? Because of tradition. Now, it was customary to leave their names out. Everybody left their names out.
Right.
It was a conventional
Not just
tradition.
not just
Everybody.
biblical. Yeah, just
That's
anybody.
what I'm saying. I gave Plutarch as an example. Good luck finding his name anywhere in his biography. So how do we know? There were traditions associated with history. Whenever you have history, you have to have tradition.
Sure.
What is history? History is a recording events, places, people, things, right? It's the recording events over time. What is tradition? Tradition is the means. It's the habits that we adopt in order to confer, to translate, to pass on that history. And we still do this today. It occurred to me as I was driving over here, because I was over something else with Sidebar. I was actually thinking of the Dobbs ruling that overthrew Roe. Shitty jurisprudence for 50 years. That's Dobbs versus, I think it was Jackson Women's Health. If you look at the reading of that decision from the United States Supreme Court, they referenced history and tradition over 110 times. So in order to interpret the Constitution of the United States, they have to go back to the history and tradition
Sure.
to see that certain preferences,
100%.
right, concerning, in this case, the sanctity of human life, what do they say? Deeply rooted in the history and the tradition of the United States of America.
Yep.
So we still do this today. This is a common historical practice. So I don't want to hear a damn thing about, oh, I'm sorry, that's tradition. Well, in that case, just throw out modern civilization while you're at
Everything,
it.
yep, that's right.
And tell the United States Supreme Court they can't ever write another hearing where they cite history and tradition. It's nonsense.
Yeah.
Anyway, sermon's over. Go ahead, Jeff. I'm sorry, I'm interrupting him.
Just out of curiosity, because Bill acknowledges that Paul lived. That was kind of a fascinating.
Contemporary.
Yeah. And because for decades, Bill has been questioning if Jesus ever existed at all. So
I
the fact
agree.
that he even acknowledged Paul as a person was kind of interesting. But the reason why I'm asking this is because, okay, so that then his point of view and secular people's point of view is that Paul existed, but somehow he was just inserted into the book of Acts as like this imaginary character that was never really there, but yet he's a real person 30, 40 years later, or 20 years later. So I don't understand where they're getting that from. That's a huge leap.
Well,
They're pulling that out of, what do they call it?
their ass.
The proverbial culo, right? Because if you think about how Paul's introducing, you've read this a million times, Nico. In Acts chapter 7, you've got the crucifixion. You've got the death, the execution of Stephen, right?
Yes.
And Paul is presiding over it. It's really fascinating. You go to Acts chapter 7, somewhere on verse 55, and read forward. I get this picture because it really paints a colorful picture of Paul just sitting there,
Yep, overlooking it.
Yep.
overlooking this,
Yeah.
and reveling in it.
Yep.
I mean, he is a insatiable murderer.
Yeah.
And he is doing it for God.
Yep.
In his view.
Right.
Right? I mean, he's proud of what he's doing. He thinks he's actually pleasing God. And then, I think it's just beautiful what happens in Acts chapter 9, where he's thrown off his horse. And he's blinded. And who are you? I am Jesus, whom you persecute.
Yeah.
I mean, it must have been like you want to talk about the quintessential oh shit moment.
Yeah.
And no wonder his change was so profound. I have been slaughtering your people, Lord. I mean, you
Well,
want to
it's
talk
interesting.
about,
He
that's
says-
what I think is the thorn of the
Before
flesh.
he reveals, I am Jesus whom you persecute, he says, who are you? Who are you, Lord? So he knows that it's God talking to
Well,
him.
I think we're getting into some theological support, which is great. I want to make sure we stay focused on his criticism and a lot of the criticism.
Well, I think it's pertinent only because notice we're talking about Paul in historical terms.
Yes.
He didn't parachute out of nowhere, Nico.
Right.
He's introduced into a narrative.
No,
which
but
is why-
I've heard Bill say a lot of things. I've heard him say, "How do you know that this is reliable? who decided these books in the Bible? What about these other books? I mean, he mentions the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Okay, that is a ridiculous.
It's a stupid
citation.
argument, yes, because the Dead Sea Scrolls only references is only relevant when you're talking about Old Testament, right? It's nothing to do with the New Testament. And he talks about the writings and who wrote them and who put these books, and then we look at copies of the originals and the manuscripts. And you and I have talked about this before, and you've heard many other people talk about it, people that you actually studied with in Biola, talk about how many manuscripts we have for ancient documents from antiquities. And
You're going to speak to the assurance that we can have that
why the New Testament with all its variants, because 500, Daniel B. Wallace talks about 500,000 variants for 140,000 words, but the variances are spelling nothing. 99.7% of what Daniel says have nothing to do to change the gospel message. They're insignificant. So
the bottom line
but
is
it's a great
we have,
soundbite, is my point.
Oh, sure.
Oh, you have 500,000 variants, and they call it inaccuracies or whatever, but not inerrancies.
Exactly.
There's a difference between variance, inaccuracies, and inerrancy, meaning it's not real or it's not true. And I just think a point to be made. Well, there's a lot of points to be made when you're talking about. I mean, I'm
like, where do you start?
Well, where do you start? I mean, because I think of chain of custody. Kind of where Jim Warner Wallace goes when he talks about, okay, we have these writing from John. How do we know that John's writing is accurate? And do we have any extra biblical writings for John? And you look at his students, Ignatius, Polycarp, Papias, and they had their students, Erroneous and Hippopotamus. How do you say it? Hippolytus, whatever. I'm screwing up these Greek names. George is better than me. All I'm saying is all these students of John, you can construct what John wrote from his student, the chain of custody. Hey, who picked up this knife? Well, Detective Jones picked up the knife, and then he marked it, and he took a picture, and then he passed it on to Detective Garcia. Detective Garcia entered it into the evidence room, and then when it came to trial, Detective Fredericks took it out, handed over to Assistant District Attorney so-and-so, and they presented it to the jury. Yeah. That's chain of custody. To know that it's been preserved. Then nobody added blood. Nobody took something off. Nobody wiped off fingerprints. It's bagged. People wearing gloves. There's a lot of things. And we have, not exactly, but we have things similar when we look at Ignatius, Polycarp, Papias, when you look at Linus, and you look at Clement from Paul.
And to be clear, we don't know what happened in the aftermath of just in the aftermath of the New Testament. We have letters that are being exchanged by the early patristics, the early church fathers, and even in the late first century, there's a bunch of correspondence that has been found.
Can I equivocate it to their emails of us today? Mm-hmm. Right, those are their letters. They're writing letters back and forth.
And this gets back to history and tradition.
Yep.
So how do we know that that, for instance, what we know about John's late life, you can learn from writers like Eusebius. These were individuals who lived in the early 2nd century. Eusebius and Ignatius, and even earlier than that, you have Polycarp and you have Clement.
Yep.
And
that's from Paul, right? And Linus.
Yeah, right. So you learn about some things that are not in the scriptures, like where Paul would have traveled to, or even some interesting information about Luke, or some interesting information.
But I love those are collateral facts that I think justify and give credence. But I'm talking about the person of Christ. If we got rid of the New Testament,
yes,
you're stuck with the character. It's not like Jesus became God. He's this historical figure. He's some kumbaya, sage. And then they add his godlike characters in the 3rd century.
Yes.
You're stuck with the Jesus of the Bible early on from extra biblical, right? That's my point I was trying to make.
Yeah, but I was going to just add that while there's information that is extra biblical and interesting, it doesn't conflict with the scripture.
No,
it's just extra information. A lot of those exchanges, those letters, included whole sections of the New Testament. That's the point I was trying to make.
Yes, 100%.
And so you've got perhaps the one that's most glaring for me, and it's a fascinating story, and people who can appreciate some church history ought to go back and get a good, solid church history book and look at the story of Polycarp, who would have written a letter right around 107 AD, 108 AD, on his way to become a martyr for Christ.
Yeah.
And in that letter, he is detailing the gospel in quoting substantial portions of the New Testament. Right. And so this is where tradition matters. And so you had a significant amount of tradition in place The narratives are in circulation. It's just that they haven't been canonized.
Right.
They haven't been brought together into a canon of scripture, right? Into a volume, an organized volume of books. And so those are very different things. To say that there was no gospel, or that there were no gospels, or much less, or even more, that the gospel writers didn't exist, or that there was no New Testament before they were actually formulated into the canon we have today is nonsense. It's absurd. In fact, if you look at, and it wouldn't have happened until the actual New Testament that we have today came to pass about 100 years after Nicaea.
Yeah, not
About 120, 130 years. And if you look at the way they decided, and so for Bill to say, well, it was people, so what? Has he studied the process that they adhere to? Has he studied the painful, systematic, historically grounded, theologically sound way to come to the canon that we have to? Does he understand that? Does he care?
But
Does it matter?
even the timeline of the writings were so much closer than other writings from antiquities. Not only just the volume. Here's a list of just sheer numbers, right? Caesar, the Gallic Wars. There's 10 copies, right? Something like that. You've gone through this before.
Yes.
in our writings. Plato has 7 copies. Plato, right? Tacitus, he was a Roman historian, has 20 copies of his writing. Pliny the Younger, 7. Thucydides, 8.
Thucydides.
Suetonius, another important writer back, these are non-Christians, by the way, 8. Herodotus is a Greek historian, not a Roman. He was 8. Sophocles, thank you. He's got a lot of more, 194. Wow, that's a lot, right? Lucretius, whatever the shit, two of them. Euripides, 9. Here's Aristotle. We all know Aristotle, 49. For Aristotle, I went to law school and we studied under the Socratic method. We don't have any writings from Socrates. We know what Socrates said because of Plato. But nobody's throwing out every law school in the United States or anywhere else the Socratic method. What are you talking about? No writings from Socrates. It's all from Plato. The New Testament, and I'm going to just round it up. This over 24,000 copies of the New Testament. 24,000. And nothing substantially different. Yes, the inaccuracies of writing, but nothing substantively different. And people want to blow that off like that's no big deal. You understand my point? But nobody brings that kind of shit up, and that's ridiculous.
I was waiting for you to say that it wasn't just the paltry number of manuscripts that we see from the ancient classical works by Caesar and Sophocles and Livy and Plato and Aristotle, et cetera, et cetera. It's not just that we have very few of them. It's that the gap of time.
Say this, please. This is important. I was going to do that, but go ahead.
This is what matters.
What do you mean by gap of time?
The gap in years between the manuscript date, the date of the manuscript.
Of the original.
The manuscript. The date between the manuscripts that we have and the original.
Okay, fair enough. That's what I mean. Okay, so the manuscripts, meaning copies, and the original for these ancient writings. Give us the numbers.
Right. So if you look and you look, for instance, at Plato, the manuscripts from Plato would be right around I'm going to say 900 AD, and so you've got about almost 1,000 years.
Okay, time out. So Plato, we all know who Plato is when we study it. The original writing versus the copies, there's 1,000 years.
Yeah,
in between the original.
I'm being conservative.
I understand. Yeah. So from the original writings of Plato to the copies, and all we have is the copies, there's 1,000 years difference.
Right. So
okay, I want to make sure that people understand that.
Let me give you a specific example of how I'm doing this. So Plato, for instance, wrote Plato's Republic.
Right.
And he would have written that circa 5th, 4th century BC. Right. And that was taught by Socrates. So the earliest manuscripts that we have from Plato's Republic, for instance, is around 900 AD.
And it was written when?
Around the 4th to 5th century BC.
BC, that's what I'm saying. I want to make sure people got that.
So that's 1,250 years.
1,250 years difference between the original writing and the copies that we rely on today.
Correct.
Okay, so I want to make sure people understand that.
So if you guys remember Sophocles, he would have written Oedipus Rex, Oedipus the King and Antigone. That's roughly right around the same time, right around 5th century. Check me out on that, but I think it's 5th century. The manuscript date that we have is around 1,000 AD. So that's 500 years. You see, so that
From the original to the copy.
yeah,
Go on.
yeah, right. So you figure why did I just say what I said? No, it's terrible math. It's 1,500 years.
500 BC to
So 1,000 AD.
Got it,
So
okay.
that's like 1,500 years. And we're talking about Sophocles. I personally like Thucydides because I like what he wrote in the Peloponnesian Wars. If you haven't read it, that's great stuff. You got to read that. So Thucydides wrote the Peloponnesian Wars, and he would have lived right around the 4th to 5th century BC as well. BC. The first manuscripts that we have would have been around 100 AD, right? So that's about 600 years.
And we don't have the originals on all these.
So when you look at the Gospels and you do that same gap analysis, it's an average of maybe 100.
That's some may a lot sooner.
I understand.
Okay.
I'm just,
You're rounding up.
I am.
Okay.
And I'm talking about manuscripts, and you can look, we can do this all night. Nico, we do 3 hours of seminars on this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Let me cut to the chase. Daniel B. Wallace, who's just a preeminent New Testament scholar. He presides over something called the Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts. The Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts. And what they've done is they have digitalized thousands and thousands and thousands. I mean, to the tune of, you mentioned 24,000. It's more than that now. It's got to be over 25,000, but thousands and thousands of manuscripts collected from all kinds of regions of the ancient world in various different languages throughout the ages. And what they've done is they've compared those biblical manuscripts across the ages, across geographies. And they've analyzed to see what kind of consistency do we have. And what we have found is a remarkably stable text so that we can say, because we have so many.
Yep.
And across thousands of years. And so we can honestly say that the Bible that we read today is over 99% accuracy. And I'm being conservative here. They actually pushed that number up to 99.9%.
And he says the only inaccuracies that are questionable are 1/5 of 1% of them.
Yeah.
That could potentially be something to debate theologically.
If you add
1/5 of 1%.
Right.
It's insane.
And no critical message of the gospel
is changed.
No critical message of biblical and of biblical doctrine is in question. And by essential Christian doctrines, I'm talking about the nature and character of God.
The virgin birth.
Right. The nature and character of Jesus. The message of the gospel itself. The biblical doctrines on sin. These are make or break things, right, in the Christian faith. So to see that kind of stability and that kind of it's stunning. And there's no ancient work that even comes close. And to your question earlier, what do? Do we go through the great libraries of the world and just throw them into the ocean? On that center, it's foolish, it's nonsense, it's ridiculous.
Look, I mean, there's so much good work that's been done on this. I mean, we're blessed to have so many good apologists out there, but not a lot get as much airtime as some of these detractors. And I'd wish, and then some of them are so intelligent, but maybe don't have that oomph to advocate it and to litigate the issue. You know, they're more the expert witness versus the advocate that's making the closing argument, which is what I do, you know, in court. But look, we have so much information. I tell people all the time.
We should get in front of Mar. We should get in front of Bill.
Well,
and
he's
have
not
this
going to get in front of us. I mean, I'd love to talk with him. Look, and I do it respectfully because, I mean, you know, we give him kudos when it's appropriate.
You would have to use that presentation that you gave of 51 minus 3 years to 48 minus 14 years. You that's what you would need to.
Well, the reality is that.
But that's just one example.
We're just scratching the surface.
Yeah, that's one example.
We could do this all.
He's not drawing the line in the sand on Paul. He actually gives the most credence to Paul. But Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. I mean, these people. It's so rudimentary, his arguments and his criticism.
We've got the Caesars referred to in the Gospels all the time. One of our favorite passages, of course, in Matthew chapter 22, verses 15 to 22, where Jesus is basically dismantling the argument that there's some conflict between paying taxes and being a good believer. Remember that? Mm-hmm. And he just shreds the Pharisees and the Herodians, which is a King Herod cult. And I love that because, I mean, that's a historical moment there. And they basically try to trap him and say, Jesus, is there a conflict between Jewish law and paying taxes to Caesar? And Jesus says, interesting, you should ask that. You guys trying to get me into a trap? Good luck with that. And he basically says, hey, who's
denarius? Whose name? Whose
but
face?
that's right. Whose image? Whose image is that on your coin? Which is a denarius, about a day's wage, like you said, Jeff. And he said, well, it's Tiberius Caesar, and we know exactly because we have tons of archaeological evidence from the first century. Well, that's right. It would have been Tiberius Caesar, son of the divine Augustus,
Son of the gods.
and who was called a high priest because the emperor would have been considered the high priest of the Roman pantheon of gods. And so that pegs, and we're just getting started, that pegs the moment at which Jesus is asking that question. So when did Tiberius Caesar live? And does it make sense that we would place Jesus there? And Tiberius
Even Pontius Pilate. It's like you can't deny that either.
Well, Tiberius Caesar ruled
Right.
between 14 AD and I think 37 AD.
Right in there. In
So,
Jesus'
so
life.
that makes perfect. We do this all day long. Luke chapter 3, verses 1 and 2. He goes character after character. People that are historical people, provincial leaders. You could literally go and triangulate every single one of them and pigeonhole Jesus to 29 AD, which is exactly when you would have expected him to be ministering. Nico, we could do this all day long, chapter after chapter after chapter. Does this? And I resent the fact that he called it an anthology. Well, the Bible is.
Well, explain what that is. Real
An
quick.
anthology is merely a collection of poems or sayings.
Right.
It's bullshit. The Bible is riddled with historical narrative. That's not poem. It contains poems.
the Psalms.
Sure it does.
Especially in the Old Testament.
But the idea that you would reduce the Bible to that, I mean, it's utter foolishness. You've got an ignorant dude talking to an ultra ignorant dude, and this is what passes along as instruction.
Well, Chris,
or critique.
I think
anyway.
Chris is genuinely ignorant, right? He's young in this. He just brand new reading off that book. I know,
I don't
but
mean it as a dig. I'm just saying
but
ignorance is
the
ignorance.
only constructive criticism is in his fervor and zealousness and zeal.
Jumped a little too.
He jumped into the water and he wasn't ready for the current, and not that Bill is some great debater, and I'm not being disrespectful to Bill because I'd love the opportunity to talk with him and just reason with him. Look, for me, I'll just leave with this. When I was coming to faith, and even though I was born and raised Catholic, after my brother was murdered and I was questioning God and angry at God and pissed off at him and hated everybody and hated everything, when I came back to the point of, do I believe in intelligent design or natural selection through random mutation? Forget Christianity for a second, forget Islam, forget everything else. Do I believe in intelligent design or random shit? And I came to the point, and you look at the evidence from the cosmos to the way the body's designed, to the functions, the bacterial flagellum, to reproduction, to your eyes, through the specificity of all the different species. It's insane. I believe, and I think the evidence strongly supports intelligent design. Now, once I got there, I just said, okay, now who's the intelligent designer? Is it Allah, Yahweh? Is it Hare Krishna? Is it Buddha? Is it the universe? Who is it? Who's the intelligent? Then I came to a study and an analysis of who could be who claims to be the intelligent designer, and then who does the evidence support that intelligent design? I started there. I didn't even start with which religion because I didn't know I was so pissed and lost and angry and resentful. I just said, there's truth out there. Are we random? Then none of this shit matters. Or are we intentional and designed? Then it all matters. That was it for me. And when I came to there's an intelligent designer, then I wanted to identify who that designer was. I didn't name him yet, or it, or whatever. And then that was my journey. And then I went through Christianity and origin, morality, meaning, destiny, what makes sense, going through the Gospels, why those 66 books, all that kind of stuff. Josh McDowell from Ravi, even Ravi helped out. Jim Warner Wallace. I went to the atheists. I wasn't an atheist, but I was so angry that I didn't know what I believed. I was just so pissed off at God after Mike passed. Everything was taken from us. And then you get to the point, not exactly a Lee Strobel scenario, but I came to a realization you've heard me say before, George, where I said, shit, what do I do? This is true. I mean, I believe this stuff. I mean, and there's evidence to support it. Whether you can regurgitate every bit of evidence that persuaded you along the way, that's the part that I think people make mistakes on. This guy read this book, and he's being persuaded as he's reading this book. But he hasn't studied why he's being persuaded and hasn't dissected it, so he cannot commit it to memory the way you do, me at a lower level, you at a higher level. But, he hasn't committed it to memory, or that he's totally, it's ingrained in him yet. And so then he embarks on this debate or this sparring session, and he really wasn't ready for it. So it forces him to give in and agree to shit he didn't have to, nor should he have.
I think we were just touching on that in the men's Bible study. There's a difference
Wednesday.
between having some knowledge and then having understanding. You can acquire some facts, but you need to organize those facts in a logical way so that you understand it, and maybe just sort of replay it over in your head. Can you take these various seemingly disparate facts, put them along, because we're talking history, put them in a timeline in a logical manner, and can you convince yourself? Are you able to make sense to yourself?
Yeah.
And that shows that you have some understanding. Never mind the practical and the personal application, which is wisdom. But do you have an understanding of what you're reading? And I think, unfortunately, not to be a dig on him, I think he actually reflects the level at which the average Christian is operating.
Yeah, I
today.
agree.
And unfortunately,
Well, then, because it's easy to persuade you away from that, right? And so I think as we wrap up,
Takes true study.
we studied it on Wednesday, and we've been going through 2 Timothy 3. Last days, perilous times, everything's going to hell in a handbasket. It's a big shitstorm out there, but for you, Christian, Paul is saying, you got to live differently, right? And he gives the prescription in my opinion, in 2 Timothy 3:14. He says, but continue in what you have learned and been convinced of. So you can learn something, but you have to be convinced of it to truly be able to withstand the storms of life and the advocacy. What you have learned, continue in what you, the world's doing this shit and it's going crazy. But for you, we're supposed to be set apart, not set above, set apart. Continue in what you've learned and have been convinced of. It's not enough just to learn something. You have to be persuaded, convinced of it for you to withhold it and persevere through all the shit storms in life. So I hope this was helpful. I mean, right, to people watching these little clips. Thank you, George, for your knowledge. Guys, thanks for being here. Jojo, thanks for coming back. Guys, I hope you enjoyed this. Share this with someone that you think you may benefit from it. We appreciate you guys watching. We're really going to working on some new things here coming up this year and maybe into the summer, really expanding R-rated Christianity. God willing, we need your help doing it. The book should be done by April. I mean, we're just proofreading it and doing kind of things and just too many irons in the fire. But let's see what the Lord has planned this year. And we just appreciate your loyalty and your support, and again, share this with people you think may benefit from it.
Want more from Nico and George? Tune into Sidebar on Saturday mornings, 9 a.m. on 1200 WAI.
I did do that to your voice. That was Jeff. That's very good. All right, guys. Yeah, Sidebar 9 a.m. WAI or on Facebook Live. God bless you guys. Thanks for joining us.